Book 1. Threads of the Multiverse Chapter 1. The weight of chains the sun bore down mercilessly on the labor camp, its rays shimmering off the jagged stone walls that enclosed the brothers. Zayn stumbled under the weight of the massive block he carried, his legs trembling as sweat poured down his brow. The coarse burlap sack draped over his shoulders offered little protection against the sharp edges of the stone. "Keep moving," barked the foreman, his whip snapping through the air, "or you'll wish you'd never been born." Zayn clenched his jaw and pushed forward, his arms burning from exhaustion. He was only 13, but he'd spent most of his short life in these camps, breaking stones and hauling materials for the wealthy elite who lived in Rhaziel's opulent cities. His brothers, Kael and Darian, worked nearby, their own burdens carried with a strength Zayn could only envy. "You're lagging again, Zayn," Kael hissed, his voice low enough to escape the foreman's ears. At 19, Kael was quick, wiry, and sharp-eyed, always watching out for Zayn. "Do you want another lashing?" "No," Zayn muttered, shifting the stone on his back. His legs buckled slightly, but Kael stepped in, steadying him with one arm. Zayn glanced up at his older brother, frustration bubbling inside him. He hated being the weak one, the one who always needed saving. "Just focus on staying upright," Kael said, his tone softening. "We'll make it through this." Darian, the eldest at 24, worked a few feet ahead. His broad shoulders glistened with sweat as he carried 2 stones at once, his movements precise and deliberate. Unlike Kael, Darian rarely spoke, but when he did, his words carried weight. He turned back briefly, his piercing gaze landing on Zayn. "Kael, let him carry his load," Darian said, his deep voice calm but firm. "He needs to get stronger." Kael frowned, but released his grip on Zayn. "He's just a kid, Darian. He's doing his best." Darian didn't respond. He hoisted his stones onto a cart and returned to the line, his expression unreadable. Zayn felt a pang of shame, his cheeks flushing as he forced himself to stand taller. He didn't want to be a burden, not to Darian, not to Kael, and certainly not to himself. The day dragged on, each hour blending into the next. By the time the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the camp in shades of orange and purple, Zayn's entire body ached. The workers were herded back into their quarters, small, cramped shacks that smelled of damp wood and sweat. Zayn collapsed onto the dirt floor, his arms trembling as he leaned against the wall. Kael sat beside him, offering a faint smile. "You did better today." Zayn scoffed. "I almost dropped the stone. Again." "But you didn't," Kael pointed out. "You're tougher than you think, Zayn. You just need to give yourself time." Darian entered the shack moments later, his presence commanding as always. He carried a small sack of stale bread, tossing a piece to each of his brothers. "Eat," he said simply. Zayn chewed slowly, his stomach growling despite the dry, flavorless bread. He watched Darian, wondering how his eldest brother managed to stay so composed. Darian's hands were calloused, his back scarred from years of lashings, but he never seemed to falter. "Do you think it's true?" Zayn asked suddenly, breaking the silence. "What they say about the ultimate elements?" Kael's eyes lit up, but Darian's expression darkened. "It's just a story," Darian said gruffly. "Fairy tales don't help us survive." "But what if it's real?" Zayn pressed. "What if there's a way to—" "Enough," Darian interrupted, his voice sharp. "We can't afford to waste time on fantasies." Kael leaned closer to Zayn, his voice dropping to a whisper. "He says that, but he used to believe in them too. Before," he stopped himself, glancing at Darian. "Before everything." Zayn's curiosity burned, but he knew better than to push further. The ultimate elements were said to grant unimaginable power, enough to challenge even Rhaziel, the tyrant who ruled their world. Zayn had heard whispers of the artifacts among the workers, tales of hidden treasures that could change their fate. It was a dream, distant and fragile, but it was all he had. That night, Zayn couldn't sleep. The air inside the shack was stifling, the sounds of restless workers filling the darkness. He stared at the wooden ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of freedom and power. A sudden scream pierced the air, followed by the harsh crack of a whip. Zayn bolted upright, his heart pounding. Outside, the foremen were dragging a man across the camp, his body limp and bloodied. Kael stirred beside him, his face pale. "What's happening?" Darian stood, his jaw clenched. Someone tried to escape. The three brothers peered through the cracks in the wall, watching as the foreman tied the man to a post in the center of the camp. Rhaziel soldiers stood nearby, their gleaming armor a stark contrast to the filth of the workers. "This is what happens to traitors," one of the soldiers barked. He raised his sword, and the man's cries were silenced with a single brutal strike. Zayn turned away, bile rising in his throat. He felt Kael's hand on his shoulder, steady and reassuring. "That's why we have to be careful," Kael murmured. "One wrong move, and we're next." Darian sat down again, his face like stone. "We'll get out of here," he said quietly. "But we have to be smart about it." Zayn looked at his brothers, a mix of fear and determination swelling within him. He didn't know how they would escape, or if the ultimate elements were real, but one thing was certain. He couldn't survive without them. Chapter 2. Broken bonds, the camp awoke to the blare of horns, the harsh sound ripping through the silence of the early dawn. Zayn jolted upright, his body still aching from the previous day's labor. Outside, the overseers shouted commands, and the metallic clinking of chains echoed through the air. "Up now!" a foreman bellowed, slamming the butt of his whip against the shack's wooden door. Darian was already on his feet, his expression stoic, as he pulled Zayn and Kael to their feet. "No hesitation," he muttered. "Move before they have a reason to target you." Zayn scrambled to follow, still shaking off the remnants of sleep. The brothers filed out of the shack with the other workers, their shoulders hunched under the weight of oppression. The air was thick with dust, and the morning sun cast long shadows over the barren yard where the workers gathered. As the overseers assigned tasks, Zayn's heart sank. The quarry again. His hands were still blistered from the sharp stones, his muscles weak from lack of food. He glanced at Darian and Kael, who stood in another line, assigned to the heavier work of hauling finished bricks to the storage wagons. "Zayn, focus!" barked one of the foremen, shoving him toward the quarry. Zayn stumbled forward, his stomach twisting in knots. He hated being separated from his brothers. Without them, he felt exposed, vulnerable. Hours dragged on in the quarry. The sun climbed higher, its heat relentless as Zayn worked to chip away at a massive boulder with a dull pickaxe. Every swing sent shocks of pain through his arms, and his vision blurred with sweat. The overseers patrolled the edges of the pit, their whips ready to strike at the first sign of slowing. "Keep moving, runt," one of them snarled, his shadow looming over Zayn. The man's face was twisted in a permanent scowl, his eyes scanning for weakness like a predator searching for prey. Zayn gritted his teeth and swung the pickaxe again. The tip glanced off the rock, and the vibration jarred his arms. He gasped, stumbling backward. "You call that work?" The overseer's voice rose, drawing the attention of nearby workers. "Pathetic." Zayn tried to steady himself, raising the pickaxe again, but his grip faltered. The tool clattered to the ground, and he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. "Useless whelp," the overseer growled. "Maybe a reminder will teach you how to hold a tool." Before Zayn could react, the whip cracked across his back. Pain exploded through him, and he collapsed to his knees, clutching the dirt as tears sprang to his eyes. From across the yard, Kael and Darian heard the sound of the whip. Kael's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he spotted Zayn crumpled on the ground. "Stay here," Kael hissed to Darian, but his older brother grabbed his arm. "No!" Darian said, his voice low but commanding. "You'll make it worse. If they see us interfere, they'll target all three of us." Kael clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "He's just a kid, Darian. He can't take this." Darian's gaze hardened, but Kael broke free, darting toward the quarry. Darian cursed under his breath, following close behind. "Get up, boy," the overseer snarled, raising the whip again. Zayn struggled to his feet, his back screaming in pain. He bit his lip to keep from crying out, his vision swimming. "That's enough," Kael's voice rang out, clear and sharp. The overseer turned, his eyes narrowing as Kael approached. "And who are you to tell me what's enough?" the overseer sneered. "Another scrawny slave who thinks he's above the rules?" Kael didn't flinch. "He's doing his best," he said evenly. "If you want more work done, you won't get it by crippling him." The overseer's lip curled into a cruel smile. Bold words for a worker. "Perhaps you'd like to take his place." Before Kael could respond, Darian stepped between them. His presence was commanding, his broad shoulders and piercing gaze enough to make even the overseer pause. "We'll take double shifts if that's what you want," Darian said. "But leave him alone." The overseer looked Darian up and down, his scowl deepening. "Double shifts?" he repeated, as if considering the offer. Then his whip lashed out, cracking just inches from Darian's feet. "You're lucky I don't take all three of you to the stocks." He spat on the ground and stalked off, leaving Zayn trembling. Darian turned to his younger brother, his face stern but his voice soft. "Can you walk?" Zayn nodded, though his legs felt weak beneath him. Kael stepped forward, wrapping an arm around Zayn's shoulders to steady him. "You shouldn't have stepped in," Darian said to Kael as they moved away from the quarry. "You'll draw attention to us." "And what was I supposed to do?" Kael shot back, his voice filled with anger. "Stand by and watch him get beaten?" "Yes," Darian said bluntly, "if it means keeping him alive." Kael fell silent, his jaw tightening. Zayn felt the weight of their words, guilt washing over him. He hated being the cause of their conflict, the reason they had to take risks. "I'm sorry," Zayn muttered, his voice barely audible. Kael shook his head. "You don't need to apologize. This isn't your fault." "It is," Darian said, his tone cutting. "He needs to learn to carry his own weight." Zayn flinched at the words, but Darian's expression softened slightly. "Not for our sake," he added. "For his." That night, Zayn lay awake in the cramped shack, his back throbbing with pain. Kael sat beside him, tending to the welts with a damp cloth. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the muffled sounds of the other workers sleeping. "You're not weak, you know," Kael said quietly, "no matter what he says." Zayn didn't respond. He stared at the wooden ceiling, his mind replaying the events of the day. The overseer's whip, Darian's stern words, Kael's unwavering support. They all swirled together, leaving him feeling more lost than ever. Kael sighed, setting the cloth aside. "You're stronger than you think," he said. "You just need a chance to prove it." "How?" Zayn asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "When all we ever do is survive?" Kael hesitated, glancing toward Darian, who sat in the corner of the shack, sharpening a broken blade he had smuggled in. "We'll find a way out of this," Kael said. "We have to." Zayn wanted to believe him, but the weight of their reality was crushing. He closed his eyes, his body aching, and drifted into a restless sleep filled with dreams of power and freedom. The following morning, the foreman gathered the workers for their assignments. Zayn stood between Kael and Darian, his body stiff but his resolve hardening. He caught a glimpse of the overseer who had whipped him, his cruel smile etched into Zayn's memory. "Stay close," Darian said under his breath. "We're moving soon." Zayn's heart skipped a beat. "Moving?" he asked. Darian nodded, his eyes scanning the yard tonight. "Be ready." Kael leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "We found something last night. A map." Zayn's pulse quickened. For the first time, he felt a glimmer of hope, a spark that might ignite the fire he needed to survive. Tonight, everything would change. Chapter 3. The great escape. The moon hung high in the sky, its pale light casting long shadows across the camp. The faint hum of crickets and the occasional murmur of restless workers were the only sounds that broke the stillness. Inside the cramped shack, Zayn sat between Kael and Darian, his heart racing as they whispered their plans. "We'll leave just after the second patrol passes," Darian said, his voice barely above a murmur. He crouched over a roughly sketched map, its edges frayed and corners smudged with dirt. "There's a breach in the eastern wall. Kael and I scoured it last night. If we move quickly, we can slip through before anyone notices." Zayn studied the map, though the faint candlelight made it difficult to see. His hands trembled with both fear and anticipation. "And if they catch us?" "They won't," Kael said firmly. He glanced at Darian, who gave a curt nod. "We've accounted for everything. But you have to keep up, Zayn. No stopping, no hesitation." "I'll try," Zayn whispered, though doubt gnawed at him. He didn't want to slow them down, but he couldn't shake the memory of his earlier punishment. His back still ached, and his legs felt like jelly. What if he couldn't do it? "You can," Darian said, as if reading Zayn's thoughts. "You're stronger than you think." Kael smirked. "And if you're not, we'll drag you the rest of the way." Zayn managed a small smile, though his stomach churned with nerves. He clung to their words, hoping they were right. The first patrol passed shortly after midnight. Heavy boots stomped through the camp, accompanied by the metallic clinking of armor and the occasional bark command. Zayn held his breath as the guards walked past their shack, his pulse quickening with every step. Darian motioned for silence, his hand gripping the hilt of the crude blade he'd fashioned from scrap metal. Kael crouched by the door, peering through a crack in the wood. The seconds stretched into minutes, each one feeling like an eternity. When the guards finally disappeared around the corner, Darian whispered, "Now." Kael eased the door open, the creak of the hinges barely audible. The three brothers slipped outside, sticking to the shadows as they crept toward the eastern wall. Zayn's heart thundered in his chest, his ears straining to catch any sound of approaching footsteps. The camp was eerily quiet. Most of the workers were asleep, their exhausted bodies sprawled across the dirt floors of their shacks. The overseers were stationed near the main gates, their torches flickering in the distance. Zayn focused on Darian's steady movements ahead of him, trying to match his brother's silence. Kael paused at the edge of a storage shed, motioning for the others to stop. "There," he whispered, pointing to the breach in the wall. A narrow gap, barely wide enough for a person to slip through, was hidden behind a stack of lumber. Zayn's chest tightened. The opening looked so small, so far away. His legs trembled as he imagined the guards catching them before they could make it. But Kael's hand on his shoulder snapped him out of his thoughts. "Stay close," Kael said, his voice firm but encouraging. "We've got you." Darian led the way, his broad frame moving with surprising agility. Kael followed, his movements quick and fluid. Zayn brought up the rear, his eyes darting nervously around the camp. Every shadow seemed to shift, every distant sound felt like a threat. When they reached the breach, Darian crouched low, inspecting the gap. "Clear," he said. "Go." Kael slipped through first, his wiry frame fitting easily. Zayn hesitated, his palms slick with sweat, but Kael's hand reached back through the gap, steadying him. "Come on," Kael urged. "You can do this." Zayn took a deep breath and crawled through, the rough edges of the stone scraping against his arms and legs. On the other side, Kael pulled him to his feet. Darian followed last, his larger frame making it a tight squeeze. When he emerged, he immediately scanned their surroundings, his eyes sharp and focused. "This way," Darian said, motioning toward the forest beyond the camp. The brothers darted across the open ground, their footsteps muffled by the soft grass. Zayn's lungs burned with the effort, but he pushed himself to keep up, spurred on by the promise of freedom. They reached the edge of the forest just as the second patrol began. The distant shouts of guards echoed through the night, and Zayn's stomach dropped. "They know we're gone," he panted. "They'll search the camp first," Darian said, his tone calm but urgent. "We've got time. Keep moving." The forest was dense, the towering trees casting deep shadows that swallowed the moonlight. The air was cool and damp, the ground uneven beneath their feet. Zayn stumbled over a root, but Kael caught him before he could fall. "Careful," Kael said, his grip firm. "We're not out of danger yet." They pressed on, weaving through the underbrush as quickly and quietly as they could. The sounds of pursuit grew fainter, but Zayn's fear didn't abate. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig sent his heart racing. After what felt like hours, Darian finally slowed, signaling for the others to stop. They gathered in a small clearing, their breaths ragged and their clothes damp with sweat and dirt. "We'll rest here," Darian said, leaning against a tree. But only for a moment. Kael sat beside Zayn, his chest rising and falling with deep breaths. "You're doing good, Zayn," he said, his voice soft. "Better than I expected." Zayn managed a weak smile. "Thanks. I think." Kael chuckled, but his expression grew serious as he glanced at Darian. "What's the plan now?" Darian pulled out the map, spreading it across his knee. "We head east," he said, tracing a line with his finger. "There's a village near the edge of the verdant shroud. If we can make it there, we'll blend in with the travelers." Kael frowned. "That's a long way." "We don't have a choice," Darian said. "The camp will send search parties, and they'll scour the nearby forest first. We need to keep moving." Zayn stared at the map, his exhaustion warring with his resolve. The journey ahead seemed impossible, but the alternative was unthinkable. He looked up at his brothers, their faces illuminated by the faint glow of moonlight. They were tired, battered, but determined. "I'll keep up," Zayn said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I promise." Kael clapped him on the shoulder. "That's the spirit." Darian folded the map and tucked it away. "Get some water," he said. "We leave in 5 minutes." As they rested, Zayn couldn't help but think about the stories their parents used to tell, the myths of the ultimate elements hidden across Etherean. He didn't know if they were real, but the thought of power strong enough to challenge Rhaziel gave him hope. For the first time in years, he felt a spark of something more than fear and despair. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep him moving. "Let's go," Darian said, rising to his feet. Kael helped Zayn up, and the three brothers disappeared into the forest, leaving their chains and their old lives behind. Chapter 4. The Great Escape. Part 2. The forest seemed alive, pulsing with its own rhythm. The rustling leaves, the distant hoot of an owl, and the snapping of twigs underfoot created a melody that was both comforting and ominous. Zayn trudged between Kael and Darian, the moonlight filtering through the dense canopy, casting fleeting patterns on the forest floor. His legs ached, and every step felt heavier than the last. Still, the spark of hope in his chest pushed him forward. For the first time in his life, he was no longer a slave. The idea was almost too big to grasp. "Stay close," Darian whispered, his voice barely audible over the crunch of leaves. His sharp eyes scanned their surroundings, always alert. "If you can't hear me, you're too far." "I'm fine," Zayn muttered, though he wasn't sure how much longer his body could hold out. Kael smirked, his tone lighter despite the tension. "Don't let him scare you, Zayn. He's just mad he can't boss us around as much now." Darian shot Kael a pointed look, but said nothing, his focus unshaken. Kael leaned closer to Zayn, adding quietly, "That's his way of saying he cares. Trust me." Zayn wanted to believe that. Despite Darian's hard demeanor, his actions always spoke louder than his words. He was the reason they had survived this long. Hours passed as they wove deeper into the forest. The dense foliage provided cover, but it also slowed their pace. Zayn's breathing grew heavier, his muscles burning from the strain. His foot caught on a root, and he stumbled, barely catching himself before falling. "Careful," Kael said, steadying him. "The forest floor's a death trap if you're not watching." "Maybe you can carry me," Zayn joked weakly, though his smile quickly faded at the look on Kael's face. "We'll stop soon," Darian said from ahead, his tone brooking no argument. "There's a stream up ahead. We'll rest there." Zayn's heart leapt at the mention of water. His throat was dry, and his body screamed for relief. He pushed himself forward, ignoring the sharp protests of his legs. The stream was a narrow ribbon of clear water that wound through the forest, its gentle babbling breaking the silence. Darian crouched by the bank, scooping water into his cupped hands and drinking deeply. Kael followed suit, gesturing for Zayn to join them. Zayn knelt by the edge, plunging his hands into the cool water. The relief was instant, the chill soothing his blistered palms. He drank greedily, the fresh taste washing away the stale bitterness of the camp. Kael splashed water onto his face, letting out a satisfied sigh. You know, if this weren't a life-or-death situation, it'd almost feel like a vacation. Speak for yourself, Zayn said, wiping his mouth. I don't remember vacations being this exhausting. Kael grinned. That's because you've never been on one. Darian stood, his eyes scanning the forest. We can't stay long, he said. The patrols will spread out by morning. We need to be gone before they get this far. Zayn wanted to protest, to beg for more time to rest, but he swallowed his complaints. He didn't want to be the reason they were caught. The brothers continued their journey, the forest growing denser as they moved east. The trees loomed taller, their gnarled branches forming an almost impenetrable barrier. Every so often, a faint sound, a snapping branch, a rustling bush, made Zayn's heart race. Darian, Kael whispered, his voice low. Do you hear that? Darian paused, holding up a hand to silence them. The forest felt eerily quiet, the usual hum of insects and birds conspicuously absent. Zayn's pulse quickened as he strained to hear what had caught his brother's attention. Then, faintly, the sound came again, a rhythmic thumping, like heavy boots on packed earth. Patrol, Darian said, his voice a quiet growl. They're closer than I thought. Zayn's stomach twisted. What do we do? We hide, Darian said. Now, move. He led them off the narrow trail and into the thick underbrush. The brothers crouched low, their breaths shallow as the sound of the patrol grew louder. Zayn's heart pounded in his ears, drowning out everything else. The torchlight appeared first, flickering orange against the dark greens of the forest. Then came the voices, gruff, commanding, and far too close. They couldn't have gotten far. One of the guards said, Spread out. Check every path. Zayn's hands clenched into fists, his body trembling with fear. Kael placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder, but it did little to calm him. If the guards found them, there would be no escape. Darian motioned for silence, his eyes locked on the approaching patrol. The guards were only a few feet away now, their boots crunching loudly against the forest floor. Zayn held his breath, praying they wouldn't be seen. Over here, one of the guards shouted, and Zayn's heart nearly stopped. But the voice was distant, coming from further down the trail. The torchlight shifted as the patrol regrouped, their attention drawn to the other direction. Within moments, the forest was silent once more. When the danger had passed, Darian motioned for the others to follow. They crept back onto the trail, their movements cautious and deliberate. That was too close, Kael muttered, his usual humor absent. They'll keep searching, Darian said grimly. We need to move faster. Zayn nodded, his fear fueling his determination. He couldn't afford to slow them down, not now, not ever again. By the time the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the brothers had put several miles between themselves and the camp. Exhaustion weighed heavily on them, but the sight of the rising sun brought a small measure of relief. We're almost there, Darian said, pointing to the faint outline of a village in the distance. We'll rest there, gather supplies, and plan our next move. Zayn stared at the village, a strange mix of hope and anxiety bubbling within him. For the first time in his life, he was free, but the journey ahead was far from over. As the brothers descended toward the village, Zayn glanced at Kael and Darian. Together, they had escaped the chains that bound them. Now, they would face whatever came next together. Chapter 5. Into the verdant shroud the village was smaller than Zayn had imagined, a collection of weathered stone buildings with moss creeping along their walls. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, and the faint sound of morning activity echoed through the narrow dirt streets. Farmers tended to their livestock, merchants arranged goods on rickety carts, and children darted between buildings, their laughter a strange but welcome sound after the harsh silence of the forest. Darian motioned for Zayn and Kael to follow him. "Keep your heads down," he said. "We don't know who might be watching." Zayn adjusted the hood of his tattered cloak, doing his best to appear inconspicuous. The villagers hardly glanced their way, their eyes focused on their own routines. Still, Zayn couldn't shake the feeling that someone might notice the three strangers and ask questions they couldn't afford to answer. Kael leaned close, his voice low. "Relax. We're not the only ones passing through. They'll just think we're travelers. Or escaped slaves." Zayn muttered under his breath. The thought made his stomach churn. Darian led them to the edge of the marketplace, where a weathered stood under the shade of a sprawling oak tree. The sign above the door swayed in the breeze, its faded lettering barely legible. "The Rested Wanderer." "We'll stay here for a few hours," Darian said. "Long enough to eat and plan our next move." Zayn frowned. "How are we paying for this?" Kael grinned, pulling a small pouch from his belt. It jingled softly as he held it up. "Let's just say I've got a talent for acquisitions." Zayn raised an eyebrow. "You stole it." "Borrowed," Kael corrected, slipping the pouch back into his belt. "From someone who can afford to lose it." Darian shot Kael a warning look, but didn't argue. "Let's go." The inn was dimly lit, its air thick with the scent of wood smoke and stale ale. A handful of patrons sat at the scattered tables, most of them nursing drinks or chatting quietly. The brothers found a corner table away from the others, where Darian leaned close to speak. "The verdant shroud is less than a day's walk from here," he said. "Once we reach the forest, we'll be harder to track." "And harder to survive," Kael added, his tone light but his expression serious. "That place isn't exactly welcoming." Zayn glanced between them. "What's so dangerous about it?" "The shroud isn't just a forest," Darian explained. "It's a maze. People who go in rarely come out. The trees are so thick they block out the sun, and the paths shift like they're alive. Even if you don't get lost, there are other things to worry about." Kael leaned back, folding his arms. "Wildlife, old ruins, and sometimes worse." Zayn swallowed hard. He'd heard stories about the verdant shroud as a child, tales of shadowy creatures and whispers that lured travelers to their deaths. The idea of venturing into such a place made his skin crawl, but he knew they had no choice. "What about supplies?" Zayn asked. "We don't have much." "I'll handle it," Kael said, flashing a confident grin. "You two just stay out of trouble." Darian didn't seem thrilled with the idea, but nodded. "Make it quick." As Kael slipped out of the inn, Darian turned his attention back to Zayn. "I know this isn't easy for you," he said, his tone softer than usual. "But we can't afford hesitation. Once we're in the shroud, you'll need to focus." Zayn nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. "I'll do my best." "You'll do more than that," Darian said firmly. "We're not just running anymore, Zayn. We're fighting for our freedom, for all of it." Kael returned not long after, carrying a small sack of supplies. "Not much," he admitted, setting it on the table. "A bit of bread, dried meat, and a flask of water. Should be enough to get us through the day." "Good," Darian said. He stood, motioning for the others to follow. "We're leaving." The road leading to the verdant shroud was narrow and overgrown, the edges of the forest looming in the distance. As they drew closer, the air grew cooler, and the light seemed to dim, as though the trees absorbed the sun's warmth. Zayn's steps faltered as they reached the forest edge. The trees were massive, their twisted roots snaking across the ground like the remains of ancient serpents. Thick vines hung from the branches, and the underbrush was dense with ferns and brambles. "This is it," Kael said, his voice tinged with awe. the verdant shroud. Darian didn't hesitate, stepping into the shadows of the forest. Kael followed, glancing back at Zayn. Come on, it's just trees. Zayn hesitated for only a moment before following. The air inside the forest was heavy, carrying a faint, earthy scent that reminded him of damp stone. The canopy above was so thick that only scattered beams of sunlight pierced through, creating spots of golden light on the forest floor. The further they went, the quieter the world became. The usual sounds of birds and insects were muffled, replaced by an eerie stillness. Zayn's unease grew with every step, his eyes darting to every shadow, every movement in the corner of his vision. It's too quiet, he whispered. Kael nodded. That's how you know you're in deep. The forest watches you. Darian shot him a warning look. Don't scare him. I'm not scared, Zayn muttered, though his voice wavered. Good, Darian said. Then keep moving. Hours passed as they navigated the dense forest, following faint trails that twisted and turned without warning. Zayn's legs burned from climbing over roots and ducking under low-hanging branches. The further they went, the more the forest seemed to close in around them. At one point, they came across a massive tree that had fallen across their path. Its trunk was so wide that it took several minutes to climb over, the bark rough and uneven beneath their hands. On the other side, Zayn nearly tripped over a stone half buried in the dirt. Wait, Kael said, kneeling to inspect it. He brushed away the dirt, revealing a carving etched into the stone, a swirling pattern that glowed faintly in the dim light. What is that? Zayn asked, his voice hushed. Old magic, Kael said. The kind you don't mess with. Darian crouched beside him, frowning. We're getting close to something. Stay alert. Zayn's pulse quickened. He didn't know what they were looking for, but the air felt heavier now, charged with an energy that made his skin tingle. As they continued deeper into the forest, Zayn couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows shifted in the corners of his vision, and the faint sound of whispers brushed against his ears. Did you hear that? He asked, glancing at Kael. Hear what? Kael replied, his tone uneasy. The whispers. Kael exchanged a look with Darian, but said nothing. Zayn's unease grew as they pressed on, the shadows seeming to stretch and twist with each step. Whatever lay ahead, he could feel it drawing them closer. Chapter 6. Eldarian's tale, the verdant shroud, deepened into an almost otherworldly maze. The trees grew taller and closer together, their twisted branches forming gnarled arches overhead. Shafts of light pierced through in faint, silvery streaks, casting eerie shadows on the forest floor. Every step felt heavier, as though the forest itself resisted their passage. Zayn trudged behind Kael and Darian, his breath shallow. The whispers he had heard earlier still lingered in his mind, faint and incomprehensible. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting to see something following them, but there was only the endless expanse of trees. We're being watched, Zayn whispered. Kael smirked, though his eyes were cautious. The forest watches everyone. Don't let it get to you. Enough, Darian said sharply, his voice cutting through the tension. We need to keep moving. We're losing daylight. The trio pressed on, weaving through the dense underbrush. Zayn felt the forest close in around them, the silence broken only by the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant call of an unseen bird. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of moss and damp earth. Over here, Darian said suddenly, his voice low. He crouched by a tree, motioning for Kael and Zayn to join him. Zayn knelt beside him, his eyes widening as he saw what had caught Darian's attention. In the dirt was a series of footprints, not the smooth, deliberate tracks of boots, but the uneven impressions of bare feet. Someone else is here, Kael said, his tone cautious. Could be a villager, Zayn offered, though he didn't believe it. The tracks were too deep, too erratic. Whoever or whatever had left them hadn't been walking casually. Stay close, Darian said, rising to his feet. His hand hovered near the crude blade strapped to his side as they followed the trail deeper into the forest. The footprints led them to a clearing, where a crumbling stone structure stood shrouded in vines and moss. It looked like the remains of a temple, its archways half collapsed and its carvings worn by time. The air here felt different, charged with a faint hum of energy that made Zayn's skin prickle. Kael approached the entrance cautiously, his eyes scanning the shadows within. "Looks abandoned," he said. "Doesn't mean it's safe," Darian replied. He turned to Zayn. "Stay close to me." Zayn nodded, his heart pounding as they stepped inside. The air was cooler within the temple, and the faint scent of decay lingered. The walls were lined with faded carvings depicting figures wielding elements lightning, shadow, and earth. Zayn's gaze lingered on the figure holding lightning, a strange sense of familiarity washing over him. "Look at this," Kael said, pointing to a carving on the far wall. It depicted 3 figures standing before a massive tree, their hands outstretched as if offering something to its roots. "The Trinity of Balance," a voice said from the shadows, startling all 3 brothers. Darian drew his blade instantly, stepping in front of Zayn. Kael's hand hovered near his dagger, his eyes scanning the darkness. From the far corner of the temple, a figure emerged, a man with a long, tattered cloak and an air of quiet authority. "Who are you?" Darian demanded. The man raised his hands in a gesture of peace. His face was weathered, with deep lines etched into his skin, and his piercing blue eyes seemed to glow faintly in the dim light. "My name is Darian," he said, "and if you've come this far, I believe we are after the same thing." The brothers exchanged wary glances. Darian kept his blade raised, his expression unreadable. "How do you know why we're here?" Darian chuckled softly. "Because no one enters the verdant shroud without a purpose, and because I see in you the same fire that brought me here many years ago." Kael relaxed slightly, though he still kept a hand on his weapon. "You've been here before?" Darian nodded, his gaze drifting to the carvings on the walls. "I was a seeker like you. I spent my youth chasing the myths of the ultimate elements, believing they held the power to change the world. What I found was far more complicated." "What do you mean?" Zayn asked, stepping forward despite Darian's warning glance. Darian gestured for them to sit, his movements slow and deliberate. "The Trinity of Balance," he said, motioning to the carving of the 3 figures. 3 artifacts, each imbued with the essence of the elements. Together, they hold the key to unimaginable power. But power, as I learned, comes with a cost. Zayn's heart quickened. "You've seen them?" "The artifacts." Darian smiled faintly. "I have. The conductor's core, the veil of night, and the stone of singularity. They are real. Hidden in places like this, places where only the determined or the desperate dare to tread." "Why didn't you take them?" Kael asked, his tone skeptical. Darian's smile faded. "Because the trials to claim them are not for the faint of heart. I passed the first trial but failed the second. The cost of failure was more than I could bear." The brothers fell silent, the weight of Darian's words sinking in. Zayn's mind raced with questions, but one burned brighter than the rest. If they're so dangerous, why are they here? Why not destroy them? Darian met Zayn's gaze, his blue eyes sharp. "Because they are not meant to be destroyed. The Trinity of Balance was created to test those who seek them, to determine who is worthy of the power they hold." Darian's grip on his blade tightened. "And who decides who is worthy?" Darian shook his head. "That, my friend, is for the artifacts themselves to decide." The brothers exchanged uneasy glances. Zayn felt a knot of fear and excitement twisting in his stomach. The myths he had clung to for so long were real, but they were far more dangerous than he had imagined. "What happens if we pass the trials?" Zayn asked quietly. Darian's expression softened. "If you succeed, the Trinity of Balance will grant you the strength to change your fate, to reshape the world as you see fit. But understand this. Power alone does not guarantee victory. It is how you wield it that will determine your success." Darian stood, his face set in determination. "Where's the first artifact?" Darian studied him for a long moment before nodding. He motioned toward the far end of the temple, where a faint glow emanated from a hidden doorway. Beyond this temple lies the path to the conductor's core. It is guarded by a storm unlike any you've seen, wild, unpredictable, and deadly. If you wish to claim it, you must face the storm and prove your worth. Kael grinned, though there was an edge of nervousness in his voice. A storm, huh? Sounds like Zayn's kind of challenge. Zayn's stomach churned, but he nodded. He didn't feel ready, not even close, but if this was their chance to escape Rhaziel's shadow, he couldn't turn back. Darian stepped aside, his expression grave. Then your journey begins. But remember this. The trials will test more than your strength. They will test your heart, your will, and your bond as brothers. Do not take them lightly. Zayn met Darian's gaze, a spark of determination igniting within him. We won't. With that, the brothers stepped through the doorway, leaving the safety of the temple behind as the first trial awaited them in the storm. Chapter 7. The storm awakens. The air beyond the temple was thick with humidity, carrying the scent of rain and something sharper, like ozone, electric and wild. The brothers stepped cautiously onto a narrow path that snaked between jagged cliffs. The faint glow of the conductor's core post on the horizon, a distant point of light shimmering like a beacon. Zayn's breath caught in his throat as he stared at the storm swirling above the core. Massive black clouds churned angrily, streaked with flashes of lightning that illuminated the cliffs in bursts of brilliant white. Thunder rolled constantly, a low, ominous growl that made the ground beneath them tremble. By the elements, Kael muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. That's not just a storm. That's alive. Darian nodded grimly, his eyes fixed on the distant glow. It's the first trial. The core is testing us. Zayn swallowed hard, his hands shaking at his sides. The storm felt impossibly vast, its raw energy making his own electricity feel like a flickering candle by comparison. How are we supposed to get through that? With focus, Darian said, his tone calm but firm. And together. Kael clapped Zayn on the back, grinning despite the tension in his voice. Cheer up, little brother. This is your moment, isn't it? Electricity and storms. It's like the universe wants you to win. Zayn managed a weak smile, but his stomach churned with doubt. He had barely begun to understand his powers, let alone control them. What if the storm was too much? What if he failed? The brothers followed the path toward the storm's edge, the wind growing stronger with every step. Loose stones tumbled down the cliffs, and the roar of the thunder grew deafening. By the time they reached the storm's outer boundary, Zayn could barely keep his balance. The storm loomed like a living wall, its tendrils of lightning lashing out in all directions. The core's faint glow pulsed within the chaos, an almost taunting promise of power just out of reach. Stay close, Darian said, his voice raised against the howling wind. Kael, take the rear. Zayn, you're with me. Zayn nodded, his heart pounding as Darian led the way into the storm. The moment they stepped inside, the world transformed. The wind became a living force, slamming into them from all sides. Lightning danced across the ground, arcs of energy splitting rocks and leaving scorch marks in their wake. The air crackled with power, and Zayn felt his skin prickle as static electricity coursed through the atmosphere. Stay on the path, Darian shouted, his voice barely audible over the cacophony. Don't stop moving. Zayn clung to Darian's words, forcing one foot in front of the other. Every step felt like a battle, the storm pushing against him with relentless fury. Lightning struck the ground just a few feet away, the blinding flash leaving his vision swimming with afterimages. Zayn! Kael called from behind. Focus on the energy. You're one with it, remember? Zayn clenched his fists, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He could feel the storm's energy, wild and untamed, surging all around him. It was terrifying, but it was also familiar. He closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his racing heart. The next bolt of lightning struck closer, but this time, Zayn didn't flinch. He felt the charge flow through him, a spark igniting deep in his core. The storm wasn't just a force to be feared. It was something he could understand, something he could connect with. "Darian, wait!" Zayn shouted, his voice cutting through the chaos. His older brother turned, his expression sharp with urgency. "What is it?" "I can feel it," Zayn said, his words tumbling out in a rush. "The storm, it's not random. It's alive. It's testing us." Kael caught up, his eyes narrowing as he studied Zayn. "What are you saying?" "I think I can guide us through," Zayn said, his voice trembling with both fear and determination. "But I need to focus. I need you to trust me." Darian hesitated, his eyes searching Zayn's face. Then, with a curt nod, he stepped aside. "Lead the way." Zayn swallowed hard, the weight of their trust pressing heavily on his shoulders. He closed his eyes, letting the storm's energy wash over him. The crackling of electricity, the roar of thunder, it all formed a rhythm, a pulse that Zayn began to understand. When he opened his eyes, the path ahead seemed clearer, the chaos less overwhelming. "This way," he said, stepping forward. The brothers followed Zayn as he led them deeper into the storm. The lightning seemed to shift around them, bolts arcing just far enough away to leave them unharmed. Zayn's heart pounded with every step, his connection to the storm growing stronger. He could feel its power coursing through him, a wild energy that both terrified and exhilarated him. As they approached the core, the air grew heavier, the pressure almost unbearable. The glow ahead grew brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. The storm seemed to rage more fiercely, as though fighting to keep them away. "Almost there," Kael shouted, his voice tinged with awe. "Keep going!" A sudden burst of lightning struck the ground in front of them, the force of the impact sending Zayn sprawling. Pain shot through his body as he hit the ground, his ears ringing from the thunderclap. He looked up, his vision blurred, and saw the core just a few feet away. It was a sphere of pulsating energy, its surface crackling with blue and white arcs of electricity. The air around it shimmered, distorting like a heat wave. Zayn could feel its power pulling at him, a magnetic force that made his entire body hum. "Zayn!" Darian's voice cut through the haze. "Get up. You're the only one who can do this." Zayn gritted his teeth, pushing himself to his feet. His body ached, his legs trembling, but he forced himself forward. The core's energy surged as he approached, the air growing hotter and more charged. When he was just a step away, the storm seemed to pause. The wind stilled, the thunder quieted, and the lightning froze mid-strike, hanging in the air like jagged veins of light. Zayn reached out, his hand trembling as he touched the core. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a surge of energy shot through him, stronger than anything he had ever felt. His vision went white, his body weightless as the storm's power flooded his veins. He felt his connection to the lightning deepen, his control sharpening into something far beyond what it had been. The core pulsed one final time, then dissolved into a burst of light that seemed to flow into Zayn's chest. When the storm cleared, the brothers stood in stunned silence. The path was calm now, the sky above clear and bright. Kael let out a shaky laugh. "You did it, little brother." Zayn staggered, his legs weak, but Darian caught him before he could fall. "The core has chosen you," Darian said, his voice filled with quiet pride. "But this is just the beginning." Zayn nodded, his chest still buzzing with the core's power. He had passed the first trial, but the journey ahead would only grow more dangerous. Chapter 8. Kael's sacrifice to forest was eerily quiet as the brothers retraced their steps from the heart of the storm. The calm after the tempest felt unnatural, and the air still carried the faint hum of lingering electricity. Zayn's chest buzzed with energy from the conductor's core, a sensation that felt both exhilarating and overwhelming. Every movement sent tiny sparks flickering along his fingertips, and his senses seemed sharper, as though the world had come into sharper focus. Kael clapped him on the back, a wide grin spreading across his face. "Look at you, Zayn. You're practically glowing. I think the core likes you." Zayn forced a weak smile. His body still felt drained, the storm's trial leaving him shaky and uncertain. "I don't feel much like a champion." "You don't have to feel like one," Darian said, his voice steady as always. "You just have to keep moving." Zayn nodded, falling in line behind his brothers. The adrenaline from claiming the core had faded, leaving him with a hollow sense of dread. The trial had been harrowing, but it was over. What lay ahead, however, was still unknown, and Rhaziel's forces wouldn't stop hunting them. The journey back through the forest felt longer than it should have, each step weighed down by fatigue and the knowledge that danger was closing in. Zayn tried to focus on the energy coursing through him, the power he had gained from the core, but it only served to remind him of how much farther they had to go. "We'll rest once we're clear of the shroud," Darian said, his eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of pursuit. "The next artifact won't be easy to find." "When are they ever?" Kael muttered, though his tone remained light. He glanced at Zayn. "What about you, little brother? You holding up?" Zayn hesitated, unsure how to answer. His body ached, and the new power within him felt like an unsteady flame, flickering just out of his control. "I'm fine," he said finally, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. As they reached the outskirts of the shroud, the brothers slowed, their movements more cautious. The sunlight filtering through the trees seemed brighter now, the shadows less oppressive, but the tension between them only grew. Kael held up a hand, signaling for them to stop. "Something's wrong," he said, his voice low. Darian's jaw tightened, his hand resting on the hilt of his blade. "What is it?" Kael tilted his head, listening. The forest was silent, too silent. "We're not alone." Before anyone could respond, a voice rang out from the shadows. "Step forward and lay down your weapons." Zayn's heart leapt into his throat as Rhaziel's soldiers emerged from the trees, their armor gleaming in the filtered sunlight. There were at least a dozen of them, their swords drawn and their eyes cold. Darian stepped in front of Zayn, his blade already in hand. "Stay behind me," he said, his voice calm but firm. Kael's dagger was in his hand in an instant, his stance loose and ready. "Well, this is cozy," he said, his tone laced with mockery. "I was starting to miss company." The lead soldier sneered. "You're surrounded. Surrender now, and we might let you live." Darian didn't flinch. "That's not happening." The soldier's gaze flicked to Zayn, narrowing as he spotted the faint glow of energy still clinging to him. "The boy has the artifact," he said, his voice sharp. "Take him." The soldiers moved as one, advancing with deadly precision. Darian lunged forward to meet them, his blade flashing in the sunlight. Kael followed a moment later, his movements swift and unpredictable as he darted between their attackers. Zayn stumbled back, panic rising in his chest. He wanted to help, but the power coursing through him felt wild and unstable. He raised his hands, trying to focus on the crackling energy in his veins, but the soldiers closed in too quickly. "Zayn, move," Kael shouted, his voice strained as he fought off two attackers at once. Zayn snapped out of his paralysis, narrowly dodging a soldier's blade as it swung toward him. He lashed out instinctively, a burst of electricity arcing from his fingertips and striking the soldier in the chest. The man cried out, collapsing in a heap, but more took his place. Darian fought with brutal efficiency, his strikes precise and unrelenting. He held his ground against three soldiers, his expression grim but focused. "Kael, cover Zayn," he barked. "I'm trying." Kael shot back, slashing at a soldier who had gotten too close to Zayn. The fight was chaos, a blur of steel and shouts that echoed through the forest. Zayn tried to keep up, his electricity sparking wildly as he defended himself. But the soldiers were relentless. For everyone they brought down, it seemed two more took their place. "We can't hold them off forever," Kael shouted, blood dripping from a cut on his arm. Darian's eyes flicked to Zayn, then to the forest beyond. Take him and run, he said. Kael froze, his expression tightening. What? You heard me. Darian snapped. Get him out of here. I'll hold them off. No! Zayn shouted, his voice cracking. We're not leaving you.